The other day, I made a video criticizing the PFL for their lack of promotion for their upcoming pay-per-view, the Battle of the Giants, Francis Ngannou versus Renan Ferreira for the Super Fight Heavyweight Championship, which is the best fight card, period, that PFL has ever put on. It is the best fight card that is going on Saturday, October 19th, when also we have a UFC fight card going on. But when I made that video the other day, a lot of people commented on it and said, Joey, this is the first I'm even hearing of this fight card. And I believe that PFL becoming more of a legitimate competitor to the UFC is good for fight fans. So I wanted to make a video discussing this fight card, going in depth about some of the narratives that I feel like are being glossed over, and really kind of promote this fight card in my own video, because there's a lot of fans that don't even realize what's going on. There's a lot of narratives that aren't being talked about. And admittedly, this video is going to be very Francis Ngannou centric. We're going to start by talking about some of the other fights on the card, the entire card as a whole, and some information on the card. But we're also going to take a look at a clip that honestly, it's 30 seconds. It's a Francis Ngannou interview that's very emotional that I feel like sells the card in itself. It makes you want to watch this fight. We're going to get to that clip later in the video, but let's jump right into it. Let's take a look at the card. Obviously, the main event, Francis Ngannou versus Renan Ferreira for the Super Fight Heavyweight title. Great fight. We're going to talk about that fight in depth in this video. The co-main event, we have Cris Cyborg versus Larissa Pacheco for the women's featherweight title. Great fight. Then you go down the card a little bit more. Three title fights. Johnny Eblen versus Fabian Edwards, Leon Edwards' brother. I know the UFC and Dana White have a lot of fans brainwashed due to brand loyalty and whatnot. And basically a lot of fans think if you're not in the UFC, you're not an elite fighter. Both these guys are great fighters. They would be competitive right now in the top 15 of the middleweight division. Now, I'll highlight one other fight on this main card, and that is AJ McKee versus Paul Hughes. AJ McKee is a great fighter. A lot of hardcore fans who pay attention to other organizations have been watching AJ McKee for years. I can't wait for this fight. This main card is absolutely incredible. This fight is opening up the main card. That is crazy. That makes the pay-per-view price worth it alone. Opening up the card, and I'm not saying just one fight, but I'm saying you're opening up the pay-per-view main card with AJ McKee. That's insanity. That's how good AJ McKee is. A lot of people have fantasized about AJ McKee coming over to the UFC. Now, before we really get into the main event, let's briefly talk about the co-main. Because Cris Cyborg versus Larissa Pacheco, I feel like is being overlooked. I know a lot of people kind of crap on women's MMA, but let me just say this right now. Cris Cyborg versus Larissa Pacheco for the featherweight title is better than any women's MMA fight the UFC has to offer. There are some comparable fights, maybe at 115. Even that, I would probably disagree with you. But especially when you compare it to like the women's bantamweight division. I know this is the featherweight division. But when you compare it to the closest weight class, it's not even close. We recently got Raquel Pennington versus Juliana Pena in a title fight. Let me just tell you right now, Cris Cyborg versus Larissa Pacheco is far better than that on paper or in reality. And really quickly, if you look at their resumes, you have Cris Cyborg, 22 finishes. And right now, Cyborg's on a 7-fight win streak. And her only real loss in her MMA career is against Amanda Nunes in 2018, where she rushed out, went crazy, and got brutally chinned. Her last loss in MMA, okay, she's competing in grappling and Muay Thai. Her last loss in MMA was her MMA debut in 2005. She's been a champion in every organization she's ever been in. And she's fighting Larissa Pacheco, who Larissa Pacheco is incredible. She used to be in the UFC back in the day. She was nowhere near as good as she is now. And Larissa Pacheco currently is on a 10-fight win streak. She has 19 finishes. You know how insane that is for women's MMA? And look, back in 2022, November 2022, she beat Kayla Harrison. Kayla Harrison, a lot of people have already anointed her women's bantamweight champion in the UFC, probably the best women's fighter in the bantamweight division right now. She beat her. Larissa Pacheco beat her. A lot of people didn't even expect that, okay? Now, granted, she has lost to Kayla Harrison, lost to her twice even, but she avenged that loss, okay? She avenged it and got the win back. And her last loss was all the way back in 2019. And she is a savage Both of these girls are savages. This is an incredible fight. I cannot wait for this fight. Now, in terms of start time, I've cried and whined about PFL, and you can't find prelim start times on their website, and you know, you can't find it necessarily on Google. You kind of have to deep dive to find the start times. I found the start times on ESPN+. Main card, 4 p.m. Eastern, prelims, 1:30 p.m. Eastern. If I haven't made myself abundantly clear, which I'm not even sure if I have, it is currently October 18th when I'm releasing this video. This fight card is going down on October 19th. We're less than 24 hours away. Prelims and the entire fight card starts at 1:30 p.m. Eastern. Main card starts at 4 p.m. Eastern. It is far better. This main card for PFL is far better than Michel Pereira versus Anthony Fluffy Hernandez, that fight night card. And conveniently enough, when you have the main card starting at 4 p.m. Eastern, the UFC's prelims are just starting. And you have 3 low-level women's MMA fights going on at the same time. I will be streaming at least the main card. I'm going to try to start a little bit earlier than that, but I will be streaming a watch-along at least at 4 p.m. Eastern time if you care to join me. Now, really quickly, I'm not going to talk about it too much, but if you want to see the full card here, you can go to Tapology, you can go to PFL's website, but really quickly, you can check out the prelims as well. The feature prelim has Rafion Stotts in it. So, I mean, that just goes to show you how good this fight card is. Now, I want to discuss the main event because that's really the selling point of this card. And one of the main narratives is these guys are giants. You know, Godzilla versus King Kong. And I understand that a lot of casual are interested in that. But the real narrative here is the return of Francis Ngannou. And I'm going to show you quickly their stare down. I know some people are into stare downs. Some people aren't. I'm not really into it too much. But this is one of the first times I've seen an emotional Francis Ngannou in a stare down. And also you can see the sheer size on these guys, okay? Which is absolutely insane because Renan Ferreira dwarfs Francis Ngannou. Renan Ferreira is 6'8". We'll talk about him more in a second, but let's watch this stare down.
56 3/4 pounds.
Right there, he's pointing to the tattoo of the name of his 15-month-old son who tragically passed away unexpectedly. We'll talk about that more in the video later. It's very rare you kind of see an emotional Francis Ngannou. You know, maybe it's the tragic stuff that has gone on in his life. Maybe it's the return to MMA after a couple years off. But it's very rare you see an emotional Francis Ngannou. And then I'm going to play it a little bit longer just so you can see how big Ferreira is next to Ngannou. I mean, think about how insane that is. Let me actually rewind that a second. Look how much bigger Ferreira is than Ngannou. How does he even make 265? But let me tell you this, guys. First off, this is a banger main event. I cannot wait for this fight. Renan Ferreira is not just some bum. The heavyweight division is one of the least skilled divisions in all of MMA, regardless of organization. Renan Ferreira would be super competitive in the UFC heavyweight division. I know he lost to Ante Deliha a couple years ago, but Renan Ferreira is legit in the heavyweight division and has crazy KO power and could easily chin Francis Ngannou, which would be absolutely insane to see considering Francis Ngannou is the lineal heavyweight champion. And that's one of the narratives that I feel like is being overlooked, okay? Francis Ngannou, back in March of 2021, brutally flatlined Stipe Miocic and folded him like a lawn chair, okay? To win the undisputed heavyweight title. After that, he beat Cyril Gane with a torn ACL. A torn ACL to retain and defend his title. And that was back in January of 2022. Now, if you don't know, and we're going to come back and look at Renan Ferreira's resume, and we're going to look at a couple clips as well, and talk about a few other things. But if you don't know the story of Francis Ngannou was in negotiations with the UFC. And the UFC has dirty negotiation tactics. The UFC has exploitive contracts, and they have dirty things that they do to fighters. And they were doing it to Francis Ngannou. They were icing Francis Ngannou out of his deal, kind of stalling his contract because they don't like guys, especially champions, fighting out their contracts. And ultimately, Francis Ngannou fought out his deal against Ciryl Gane with a torn ACL because he didn't want to stall out or delay it any longer. After he defeats Ciryl Gane, he retains his title. But when you fight out your deal and you are a champion in your last fight, you win your last fight and you are still the champion, you are automatically extended by 12 months or 3 fights, whichever comes first. Well, Francis Ngannou needed ACL surgery anyway, so it didn't matter to him. And the UFC, after the antitrust lawsuit, inserted a clause into their contracts for a 5-year sunset clause. It's since changed slightly, but at the time Francis Ngannou signed his contract, there was a 5-year hard out. So what it meant is from the date you signed your contract, 5 years from that date, you get to leave the UFC whether you have more fights on your deal or not because of that sunset clause that the UFC added. He negotiated with the UFC. They were unwilling to give in to some demands. They tried to shame him publicly afterwards. They said they cut him afterwards, even though Ngannou left the UFC. And he left the UFC as the undisputed UFC champion. He is the lineal heavyweight champion right now. He is the best heavyweight in MMA right now until he is defeated by somebody else, okay? And a lot of people aren't talking about that. And also, another narrative that isn't talked about, look at his resume for heavyweight. Ciryl Gane, Stipe Miocic, Jorginho Rosenstruck, and he's flatlining a lot of these dudes. Junior Dos Santos, Cain Velasquez, Curtis Blades, Alistair Overeem. Okay, Andrei Arlovski isn't that great, but that was when he was at least decent. He has a resume that makes him one of the greatest heavyweights of all time. I mean, think about this. Curtis Blades, Cain Velasquez, Junior Dos Santos, some of the biggest names in the sport, and he's flatlining all of them, including Stipe. His last loss is to Derek Lewis, which really isn't a true loss. Nobody won that fight. Neither one really fought. Both were super tentative because of the power coming back. But before that, he lost to Stipe Miocic in his first title shot. There's no shame in that. Stipe is considered widely the greatest heavyweight of all time. So losing to Stipe in 2018 and then avenging your loss in 2021, you know, it's really not that big of a deal. It's not that big of a deal. He is the lineal heavyweight champion right now, defending that belt against Renan Ferreira at the Battle of the Heavyweights pay-per-view. Now, another thing I want to talk about real quick before we talk about Renan Ferreira, because I forgot to get into this earlier. How do you watch this pay-per-view? Well, it's on ESPN Plus for the United States. If you want to see it in another country, I believe it's in DAZN, on DAZN in the UK, or you can come to this page on PFL's website. You go to How to Watch, and you can choose your country, and it'll tell you where to watch this card. I meant to say that in the beginning of the video, but again, you can easily find this on PFL's website, which is actually good for PFL. Now, anyway, Francis Ngannou, one of the greatest heavyweights of all time, took on the UFC and won, had the biggest contract in MMA heavyweight history when he signed with PFL, but he also had the freedom to go box. And he went out there and boxed Tyson Fury in 2023, October of 2023. And I don't care about the judges' scorecards. Francis Ngannou won. And if you look at his picture on Tapology, you see him dropping Tyson Fury here. Okay, he won this fight. So Francis Ngannou, if I'm PFL right now, I'm saying Francis Ngannou is not only the greatest heavyweight right now at heavyweight, he's also one of the greatest heavyweight boxers. That's what I would be saying. I don't know if you want to say that's true or not. Afterwards, he went on to take on Anthony Joshua and got flatlined. But I mean, he's boxing. I almost said fighting. He's boxing some of the best in the world. But now he's finally returning to MMA, and he's been off since January of 2022. He's had an ACL surgery since then. We don't know how he's going to look. We don't know how much better he's gotten in the time off. We don't know if he's regressed. He's gone through a lot. We're going to talk about some of those things that he's gone through here in a second. And he's taken on Renan Ferreira, who was 13-3. He's on a 4-fight winning streak, and he has 12 finishes. 12 finishes out of 13 fights. He's won 1 fight via decision, or 13 wins. 1 fight via decision. He's on this win streak. I get it's not against the best opposition, Ryan Bader, Dennis Goltsov, Maurice Green. I get it's not great. And I get, okay, he has a loss to Ante Delia, okay, back in 2022 where he got TKO'd. It's heavyweight. Guys get clipped. He is a legit threat to Francis Ngannou. Ultimately, if you want a prediction, I think Francis Ngannou is far superior to Renan Ferreira, but nonetheless, it's a dangerous matchup. Heavyweight, everyone's dangerous. And Francis Ngannou coming back from a long layoff in MMA and taking on a guy with an unbelievable reach who has a height advantage. I mean, 85-inch reach for Renan Ferreira. Let's see what's Ngannous is. I think Ngannou has a pretty long reach too. 83. It's rare that a guy's going to have a reach and height advantage over Francis Ngannou, who is a freak athlete. Now, another thing I want to talk about. We already talked about Francis Ngannou is the lineal heavyweight champion. What do we have going over in the UFC? We have Jon Jones versus Stipe Miocic for the heavyweight title going down in a couple weeks at UFC 309. This is an abomination to the sport. Stipe Miocic has not fought since Francis Ngannou folded him like a lawn chair. He has sat out for over 3 years. March of 2021 is the last time Stipe Miocic fought. He hasn't won a fight since 2020. He's fighting for the title against Jon Jones. And instead, it should be Jon Jones versus Tom Aspinall. That's what it should be. And a lot of people have said, and Dana White has kind of manipulated narratives and said, you know what? Francis Ngannou didn't want to fight Jon Jones. Well, I played it in my other video where I said the lack of promotion from PFL. I played it there. Dana White said, oh, Jon Jones is going to be moving down to middleweight because Francis Ngannou just flatlined Stipe Miocic, okay? So I don't want to hear that. What I'm trying to show here is the contrast. We have Jon Jones, who has won one fight since February of 2020 against Ciryl Gane. Fair enough. He went out there, submitted Ciryl Gane in the first round. Fighting Stipe Miocic, who has not won a fight since 2020. That's insanity. One win between them since the end of 2020. One win between, really, since what? February? No, I don't think that's accurate, actually, because I think Stipe fought in August of 2020. But since the end of 2020, we have one win between two guys who were fighting for the heavyweight title. Meanwhile, you got Aspinall kind of being frozen out of the title picture because you have to have Stipe Miocic fighting for a title that he does not deserve to fight for. I don't care what anyone says. Sitting out for that long after getting folded like a lawn chair, you do not deserve to fight for a title. So Francis Ngannou fighting Renan Ferreira, in my opinion, is a better heavyweight fight than Jon Jones, Stipe Miocic. If it's Jon Jones versus Tom Aspinall, you have an argument, okay? I would say Jon Jones, Tom Aspinall is probably the better fight. But right now, I'm more excited for Francis Ngannou versus Renan Ferreira. Next thing I want to show you, okay? And I'm just going to click through this, and this is something that I was not aware of when I did my video the other day. But this is actually something good that PFL and ESPN did. I can't play any of it because I'll probably get a copyright. I will link this video down in the description as well as the end cards if you want to check it out. But it's a 7-minute piece of Brett Okamoto going to Africa with Francis Ngannou and talking about his life story. And I'll just click through here a little bit. And it's just talking about him traveling to Morocco. And it's talking about some of his struggles as he's trying to get to the UK or France, I believe. Yeah, France, actually. And it's talking about where he came from and where he lived. At one point, you know, he's talking about where he lives here. Let me rewind back a little bit. Yeah, I believe this is his old house right here. I'm clicking through this. I would play some for you, but again, I'll get copyright. This is a great story. This is an amazing story of Francis Ngannou coming from nothing, dirt poor, somewhere where it had no opportunity, and scratching and clawing his way to the top of the UFC, and then scratching and clawing his way and fighting with one of the biggest powers in MMA, Dana White in the UFC, to then leave and sign the biggest contract in MMA heavyweight history. And now he is returning to fight in MMA for PFL's pay-per-view, the Battle of the Giants. I feel corny even saying that. But again, at this point, PFL might need to cut me a check. I hope everyone goes and watches this pay-per-view because it's an incredible card. But that's not only that. You've heard the story of Francis Ngannou and, you know, coming from nothing, which is always inspirational and always, you know, it's just something that's like, you know what? It makes you want to root for a guy. It puts some emotion into a fight. You know, I'm already kind of emotionally attached to Francis Ngannou just because I felt bad for him for the amount of hate that he's gotten and the amount of narratives and goalpost shifting that a lot of fans and Dana White has really been responsible for. Chael Sonnen, you know, being one of Dana White's sycophant and, you know, doing the marching orders. Francis Ngannou changed the landscape of MMA in general. He inspired other fighters to maybe say, you know what? I can maybe go to another organization and make more money. Maybe I can fight out my contract. Maybe there are other options. It's not going to be true for every fighter, but Francis Ngannou has inspired. He has set a path forward for other fighters to potentially do the same. That's why recently Dana White had a complete meltdown when Kevin Iole suggested that Francis Ngannou showed to other fighters the boxing route may be a legitimate path for some fighters to go make more money, and Dana White threw an absolute hissy fit. Made a video on that if you want to go check it out. It's on my channel. The last thing I want to discuss And this right here is something that I believe it's a weird gray area to say you can use this to promote a fight. But at the end of the day, promoting a fight is telling the story of the fighter, and this is part of Francis Ngannou's story. And you can do this with class. And I'm not going to read you this article right here. We're going to look at a clip here in a second. But Francis Ngannou reveals heartbreaking details surrounding death of 15-month-old son, which his son Kobe tragically passed away unexpectedly. And we'll read a couple details from here, from this article. He had some malformation on his brain, which is something that we did not know. Ngannou said, he passed out twice. The first time it was in Cameroon. We took him to the hospital. They didn't find anything. The second time was in Saudi Arabia. We took him to the hospital. They ran a lot of exams. They didn't do anything. They took an EEG. They didn't do the CAT scan or MRI because according to them, the conclusion was he had a swollen lung, and that is what pressing in his chest and stop him from breathing and creating those things. And it created that thing. The other thing I want to highlight real quick, he was not there when his son tragically passed away. He was in Dubai. I remember just getting into Dubai, and mental wise, I'm not doing bad. Life is good. I went to the gym, and maybe I should go to the club tonight. I don't go to clubs. I don't go out. I went to the gym to work out. I'm in the back cycling, and I tried to call. I wanted to talk to him, and I was on the bike. I called his mom, and his mom didn't pick up the phone. I'm like, after I'm done, I'm going to take my shower, lay in bed, and call him. 30 minutes later, I was on the leg machine. My phone rang, and it was my little brother. He said, bro, things are not going well here. I'm like, what is it? Kobe passed out and he's not breathing. We are at the hospital. They kicked me out of the room. I'm like, what's happening? As we are talking, he also trying to get information. So I lost him for like 3 or 4 minutes. Ngannou called his brother back, and the nurse at the hospital attempted to verify his relationship to the child receiving emergency medical care. That's when he heard the nurse tell his brother that his son had passed away. Think about how tragic that is. And Ngannou has talked about, he thought about retiring. But then he didn't want to say, you know what, my son calls my retirement. My son, the best way to honor my son is to fight in his memory. And you saw him when I showed you the weigh-in. He was pointing to his bicep here. That's a tattoo of his son's name, his 15-month-old son who tragically died. That is a crazy story, an emotional story going into this fight. And, you know, say what you will about Renan Ferreira. You know, I'm sure he's a great guy. I'm sure there's plenty of great stories behind him. But just knowing Ngannou's story, knowing what's happened to him, knowing what he's been up against over the last couple years, whether it be the UFC, whether you go way into the past, you know, his traveling to Paris and eventually, you know, traveling and making his way into the UFC and fighting in the United States. And then hearing about his 15-month-old son is so tragic. And it makes you want to root for him in this fight. How can you not root for him? How can you not root for a guy who had this travesty happen to him? And I want to end with this. You can check it out, of Francis Ngannou talking about the passing of his 15-month-old son.
All of a sudden, you realize that you were complaining about a lot. Instead of feeling blessed, being grateful, you were complaining about things that didn't work. But in fact, everything was working well.
How are you?
How am I?
Yeah.
Alive. I mean, surviving. But not the same. I don't think he will ever be the same. And I can explain how in just 15 months, I mean, I still ask myself how in just 15 months, a kid or a person can take this much space and basically became you, to the point that when he's gone, you feel like you're missing too. Just 15 months. I mean, 2 years ago, he wasn't there, and I was living good. He came and he left. And I felt like, I don't know, it's a weird type of thing. Basically, like, after what I was saying earlier, like, my whole life was about to fight in order for my family not to go through those situations, not to feel powerless or useless in the situation, and for the very only person that I should fight for, I didn't even have a chance. So sometimes only that idea is painful.
So there you have Francis Ngannou talking about the unexpected passing of his 15-month-old son and talking about how everything he was fighting for was essentially gone. He was fighting so they didn't feel hopeless. He was fighting so basically they didn't have to go through some of the same things that he went through in life. And in a snap of a fingers, it was gone and he didn't have a chance to do anything. And that is something that I feel like a lot of people can be emotionally attached to and make them care about a fighter more than just a surface level. I know Francis Ngannou is a freak athlete. I know he has unbelievable power. Every fight that he's in outside of the Derek Lewis fight is exciting. But there's other narratives here that should make you interested in this fight. There's other narratives here that should make you want to root for Francis Ngannou on this card. And there's some things here that I just feel like aren't being talked about enough. And I'm not talking about necessarily son. Again, you can tell that story in a classy way where it's not like you're exploiting it just to sell a pay-per-view and collect a buck. It's telling the story of the fighter. And that's what I think a lot of the times, even the UFC has kind of forgotten about a bit. They've kind of rested on their laurels. So you have Francis Ngannou returning after an over 2-year layoff from MMA, returning from an ACL injury, one of the greatest heavyweights of all time, the lineal MMA champion. Then you have his entire back life story that should make you want to root for him. And then you have this tragic family occurrence that if you can't resonate with that, I don't know what you can resonate with. So I feel like that all combined with the fact that this is an incredible pay-per-view card, you should want to order this pay-per-view. You should want to watch this fight card. And I wanted to highlight this card in general because forget about all that, forget about all the emotional stuff, forget about all the backstory. At the end of the day, this is a great fight card. This is a card that I cannot wait to see. And a lot of people don't know about it because the promotion hasn't been great. So I wanted to highlight all this in a video to kind of show you why you should want to watch this card, why you should feel emotionally invested in this card. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Are you going to order this pay-per-view? Again, you can order it on ESPN Plus or DAZN. In other countries, I'm not sure exactly where it will be, but you can check the website. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and thank you so much for watching.